Hello and welcome to Cornish Talks, a brand new podcast all about the culture, language and heritage of Cornwall in the contemporary age. Each episode will be joined by a raft of experts whose interests lie in the geography, culture, heritage and language of Cornwall. If you're here through the SWWDTP series of podcasts, a huge welcome. And if you're here through the Cornish Talk series itself, an equally warm welcome. My name is Katy Humberstone and I'm a current third-year PhD student in the Department of Languages, Cultures and Visual Studies at the Universities of Exeter and Southampton in the UK. My research sits at the intersection of Cornish and Latin American studies, and in my PhD research, I'm exploring contemporary heritage in the context of the historical migration of Cornish peoples to Hidalgo in central Mexico. For this very first episode, the Cornish Talks podcast will, well, quite literally, talk all things Cornish in the public sphere. Back in March, myself and Kensa Broadhurst, language lead at the Institute of Cornish Studies, embarked on a small-scale project to document the presence and visibility of the Cornish language in different areas of Cornwall. This project was made possible by the Institute of Cornish Studies at the University of Exeter. Today, I'll be aiming to present something a little bit different in the sense that I'll be co-hosting the podcast with Kensa, and we're going to discuss a project which we have both co-curated and collaborated on over the past few months. If you have any thoughts or have enjoyed today, please tag us by using the hashtag Cornish Talks, that is all one word, on Twitter. As I've mentioned, the topic today is all about the visibility of the Cornish language in Cornwall, but it's probably worth explaining a bit about the idea behind the project, our own particular interests, and also a little on the existing research on language in public space elsewhere. So studying the visibility of languages in public space more broadly is an academic tradition which stretches back quite a few decades by now. In fact, it has developed into a flourishing field of its own, known as linguistic landscapes, which really has its roots in the discipline of sociolinguistics, that is, the study of language in society. Many researchers have become interested in the opportunities which public spaces provide in documenting the range of languages which stand out or conversely are absent in a certain area. Minority languages have also been widely studied from a linguistic landscape angle, as public spaces can also reflect the revival, or that is the revitalisation, of a particular small or minority language, such as Cornish. Researchers have also looked to what other co-occurring features on signs, such as a typeface, image or colour, might be able to tell us. If you hear us lapse into the acronym LL during this podcast, that is two double L letters, we're just referring to linguistic landscapes. It's a widely used shorthand acronym in the field, so apologies in advance, but at least you now know what we'll be referring to. Hi Kensa, it's great to have you with us today and thank you so much for being part of Cornish Talks.
So my name is Dr. Kensa Broadhurst and I am Cornish language lead at the Institute of Cornish Studies, which is part of the University of Exeter.
Amazing. And you've completed your PhD thesis end of last year. So would you mind saying a bit more about what your PhD focused on and possibly about kind of what your findings were?
So everyone believes that the Cornish language became extinct in 1777 with the death of a lady called Dolly Pentreath. And she's quite well known within minority language circles, language history circles, sort of more generally as the last speaker. And when people talk about sort of language death, she's always one of the examples that gets trotted out by other people. And then sort of historically, the idea was that the Cornish language was revived in the 20th century, and that revival is dated from the publication of a book called The Handbook of the Cornish Language by Henry Jenner, and that was published in 1904. So basically my PhD thesis was looking at the gap between the two, so the period 1777 to 1904, to look for evidence of the Cornish language being used, so basically to challenge or accept the idea that the Cornish language was extinct. I sort of looked at issues of language status and the terminology that we use to describe language decline, language death, language extinction, all these sorts of things. And actually, what do we mean by that? So therefore, what did I mean when I was writing my thesis? But also, actually, what did people who talked about Cornish in the past mean? and were they clear with their sort of terminology and so on. And so my main findings, so Cornish has always been described as extinct during that period. Yep. And my main finding was that it should be reclassified as critically endangered. So it should be historically reclassified as having been critically endangered in that period during the 19th century rather than extinct, because actually it was very much in people's minds. It was being used. It was being used academically. It comes up as a subject in novels and newspapers and in academic works throughout the 19th century. So, yeah, those are my main findings.
Amazing. So really, your main finding points to the fact that really Cornish, from what the evidence you've gathered and what you've argued, it really didn't die out in those intervening years.
No, and there's certainly evidence of intergenerational transmission right through, and that's, in terms of minority languages, that's the key marker. And there's certainly evidence right through to the 1870s, by which point Cornish is becoming far more of a topic of interest, not just to sort of antiquarians with a bit of leisure and interest in Cornwall, but to people outside Cornwall, to academics, to people inside Cornwall. Yeah.
Amazing. No, that's really, really cool. That's great. Yeah, and I look forward to hearing kind of more about kind of future sort of publications and outputs from your PhD.
There's a book coming out next year. Yeah. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's really cool. Awesome. Okay, so kind of filtering or funneling, should I say, into the topic for today, which we've already mentioned is all about linguistic landscapes and specifically those of Cornwall in a minority language context. Kensa, can I ask you about how you got into linguistic landscapes, first of all?
So I'd love to tell you that it was this great academic burning desire to study linguistic landscapes. It's really not that. So Exeter University is part of a consortium of universities which are involved in it's called Venice International University, mm-hmm. and it's basically run by about 20 universities worldwide who run courses at this university in Venice. Both sort of long-term seminar, entire semester courses for undergraduates, but also summer schools and courses for postgrads. And they advertised a course on linguistic landscapes, and I was So the background is I did one of my master's degrees in Venice, so it was an excuse to go back, basically. So I was like, oh well, it vaguely links to my work in that I work on languages. Technically, I'm supposed to be a historian, but never mind. So I applied and got this place on this course. So I went to Venice last year, about sort of 16 months ago, and did this course on linguistic landscapes, at which point I then learned all about them. And we, as a cohort doing this course, looked at the linguistic landscape of Venice, which actually sort of in the academic literature hasn't been done anyway. So that in itself, I think, was a sort of useful thing, a useful exercise to do.
Amazing. And as a sort of tangential point with Venice, I've noticed a lot of, I don't know if you come across this with your sort of field work with your linguistic landscapes group at VIU, but I've noticed a sort of street names that have, or place names that have sort of Celtic roots, like with the TRE. I don't know if you've come across that, like Trevisan. And I've read somewhere online that it links back to Celtic origins, a long time ago.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
The main thing I've always noticed living in Venice is that it is Venetian, and it's very definitely the Venetian language, not Italian, not standard Italian. And that they have brilliantly, rigidly stuck to that. There's been since the unification of Italy in the 19th century, there's no sort of no, we've obviously got to standardise and pick up standard Italian. Everything has rigidly stuck, even through invasions by France and so on. They rigidly stuck to using Venetian in their place names. So lots of because they just don't end in vowels as you would expect in standard Italian.
That's it. Yeah. Yeah, that's cool. Amazing. Yeah, and I guess it's probably worth saying a bit about how I got into the field of linguistic landscapes. So my PhD is focused on contemporary heritage in the historical migration context of Hidalgo, to which the Cornish migrated in the 19th century. So I'm looking at the linguistic landscape more from, I guess, a kind of cultural rather than linguistic angle. And this is because of the nature of my site of research. So in Hidalgo, Mexico, obviously Mexican Spanish is the most predominant language. So I'm looking at language, images, colours, typography and objects, and what sort of that whole ensemble of different elements tells us about Cornish heritage nowadays in that context, and also how Cornish heritage is sort of transformed over the centuries and decades. So we've briefly introduced linguistic landscapes, what they can tell us about minority languages, and a bit about our interests. So I guess now it's time to move on to our project focusing on Cornwall. So I'm not really sure where the seeds were sown for our Cornwall LL project exactly, Kensa, but I guess in some ways it grew quite organically in a way. I do remember that we both discussed it as an area to research in our joint article on the Cornish language, which recently came out for the Linguistic Minorities in Europe online journal. Kensa, you and I, we decided to focus on some different sites across Cornwall. Would you mind kind of giving us a brief overview of the different sites we focused on?
So what's really interesting about Cornwall, for people that don't necessarily know, is it's a very long region. It can take 2 hours, I would say, to drive from the border with Devon down to Land's End. And it's a bit like those jokes you get about, I think it's Americans coming to the UK, you can drive for 6 hours in America and nothing's changed. If you drive for 15 minutes in the UK, the accent's changed 3 times, and so is the name for a bread roll. So we were very sort of aware that in Cornwall, historically, the east of Cornwall was very anglicised very early on. So even from sort of the 12th century onwards, we can see influence in the Cornish place names of the English language, and that sort of they stopped in one particular form rather than continuing to develop with the language. So you've already got this disconnect between the east and the west of Cornwall, but also we can't go away from tourism, and that tourism possibly isn't what everyone thinks it is as being like the major industry in Cornwall, but it does have a massive impact on Cornwall. And so therefore we had to think about audiences. Mm-hmm. And you have these audiences in Cornwall, that you have the locals, you have people that are just living a normal life, doing normal jobs, but equally we have however many million visitors a year. And therefore we have businesses and buildings and locations which are very much geared up towards tourists. So we were sort of very aware of that and trying to think about, we couldn't look across the whole of Cornwall, that would just be impossible, but that we could pick locations. So we were sort of quite concerned to make sure that we picked somewhere in the east of Cornwall, somewhere fairly central, and somewhere in the west, which basically ended up being Padstow, Truro and Penzance, but also thinking about those different audiences. So although Truro is the capital of Cornwall, it's not necessarily geared up for, aimed at tourists, whereas Padstow and Penzance are far more likely to be tourist destinations because they're on the coast. Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, thanks for that. So as you've alluded to, Kensa, really, what we really wanted to find out as a first step within this linguistic landscape project, which we've been co-working on, was the extent to which the Cornish language was visible in these 3 different areas. So some researchers of linguistic landscapes, they aim to catalogue the languages in a given zone quite systematically through counting them, for example. So that would sort of evoke more of sort of a quantitative analysis where, we go around and count sort of languages on different signs. But rather, what we've tried to do through this project, and what we're going to try to do through our forthcoming outputs on this project, is to give more of a flavour of the linguistic landscape of different spaces through a detailed analysis of a handful of examples. So Kensa, can you give us some sneak peeks of the areas which you focused on, and maybe some sort of initial insights?
So obviously with any bit of academic research, you're meant to do literature review. So we did split that between us. And I looked at what's been done about Cornwall before, which in terms of linguistic landscape, as we would understand as a sort of, so from a socio-linguistics point of view, is nothing that we can find anyway. Mm-hmm. Happy to be corrected. But what has been a long-term area of study for Cornish scholars is Cornish place names. And, they are the most visible thing. You cross the border from Devon and suddenly you are struck by road signs and every word is in Cornish. They're not in English. So I did a bit of background reading and sort of looking at making sure that as part of our literature review that we have some work on, what's been done, what is out there, both historically and what is still being done currently by the Cornish language community in terms of place names. And, there is still a lot of work happening in terms of the historic forms of place names and how those have changed. And actually, if you go on... so there's an online Cornish dictionary. So if you literally Google Cornish dictionary, you will get to it. But actually part of that is a map of Cornwall, and it's a place names website. So that you can either search or click on anywhere on the map of Cornwall, and it will tell you about that place name. It'll tell you what it means. It'll show you the historic forms. It will take it down to an elements. So not just the whole word, but the elements within it and what those mean. So there is a lot of historic research out there on Cornish place names. But to give you some sneak peeks as well into the other bits of research I've been doing, linguistic landscapes is not just about what you can see. There are scholars who think about what you can hear. And there are, we'll talk about them in a bit, but there are examples of where you can hear the Cornish language in the public sphere. We also looked at so social media, you can't get away from it. And actually there is an online group which specifically look out for and log incidents of the Cornish language being used by local businesses. So I've had a little bit of a look at that. And also in terms of places which are aimed not necessarily at tourists, but at Cornish people or people who live in Cornwall, interiors, and where some buildings have deliberately included the Cornish language in their signage and provision.
In terms of the little bits and pieces I've been working on so far in the project, I'm going to outline some of my initial insights now in relation to fieldwork and photography in terms of the linguistic landscapes of Truro and Padstow. So as we've already alluded to, Truro is the capital of Cornwall, quite a small city, as you might all know, of about 15,000-ish people. Padstow is on the north coast of Cornwall, also quite touristy, particularly in summer. So first of all, I'm going to kind of explain a little bit about my insights from Truro. So I actually coincidentally ended up going to Truro on St. Piran's Day in March. So St. Piran, as you might all know, is a patron saint of Cornwall. And what resulted in Truro, initially unbeknownst to me, was a competition encouraging businesses and shops to celebrate St. Piran's Day through window displays, with a prize awarded to the display deemed to be the best show. I captured all sorts of displays, ranging from those of charity shops featuring Cornish flags, that is the flag of St. Piran, donated books and souvenirs about Cornwall in some form, and clothing reflecting the colours of the Cornish emblem. I also spotted that the local HSBC bank had a sign reading Gul Paran Lowen, which is Cornish for Happy St. Piran's Day. There was also an intriguing display in shops, a bathroom and kitchen shop, just a few steps away from Truro Cathedral, featuring a prominent window sticker of St. Piran himself with a speech bubble reading, "Don't miss out, book your free home design visit today." In this example, there's no Cornish language evoked, but Cornish culture instead is through the imagery of St. Piran. It's also interesting how in this and other images which I've captured as part of the competition, Cornish language or culture is integrated into the overall branding and in some instances promotional material of the business. In all of these examples, the idea of celebrating St. Piran evokes the uniqueness of Cornwall with a distinct culture and, of course, language. So I also photographed some examples outside of the main St. Piran's Day competition, including fragments of Cornish language on objects such as an able belonging to the famous bookseller Waterstones, with a chalk-drawn map of Cornwall which reads Cerno, obviously the Cornish word for Cornwall, and other names which might be linked to the Cornish language, or rather sort of Cornish family names, traditional family names such as Celestic, in terms of Celestic Farm, which was on a sign for an ice cream brand, and Benaithen in another Truro-based business, which was called Benaithen Bookshop. So Kensa returned to Truro, I think, a few months later.
So what's really interesting is that some businesses in Cornwall really do celebrate the fact that they are in Cornwall. So, for example, Waterstones normally always has one of their displays will show local books, and as you go into the shop, there's always sort of the local books section is obviously there and obviously full of books about Cornwall. But they're not the only one. So, for example, Rose Pasties, which you'll find all over Cornwall, Rose obviously being a sort of Cornish surname, their branding is in black and yellow, which are the old black and gold, which are the Cornish colours.
Yeah.
But that's a Cornish company. But what's really interesting, and actually I was doing an interview with somebody about another piece of research that I'm involved in, and there's this great sort of crossing of the streams with this project, because the lady said to me, well, of course, Wetherspoons is the last place that you would expect to find bilingualism. So Wetherspoons being the UK-wide pub chain. But the Wetherspoons pubs in Cornwall have Cornish names, or names alluding to Cornish heritage. And so the pub in Truro has a Cornish name, which is Tree Dower. So, in other words, three waters.
Yeah.
And one of the possible meanings of the name Truro in Cornish is three rivers. It's one of the really contested place names, Truro, place name meanings, but one of the possibilities is three rivers. And there are, of course, three rivers which come together in Truro and then sort of go out towards Falmouth and out to the sea. So the Waterstones has the Wetherspoons has a Cornish name is really significant. And it does make me wonder how many people sort of notice that, or how many of their patrons notice that and think it's significant. However, what's really interesting is opposite. So the Hall for Cornwall is our flagship theatre in Cornwall. Yep. It's in the centre of Truro, and it was revamped a couple of years ago. And as part of that rebranding and rebuilding and so on, they've really made an effort to include a lot of Cornish, and it's visibly there. So if you look at the doors going into the Hall for Cornwall, all of the signage is bilingual. And, so one of the things that's really important in linguistic landscapes is actually thinking about sort of how prominent a language is and how sort of what fonts used and font size. And the font, the writing on the doors for the Hall of Cornwall, the English and the Cornish is the same size. So, it's not that one language is taking precedence over the other.
No.
And that's really interesting. And the Hall for Cornwall had been known, so before they closed for a few years for this revamp, they would have, in their brochures for the season, they would have a paragraph introducing, the season's output in Cornish. But they've really started to include this elsewhere in their branding and in their signage. So that's really interesting. That and that's at the heart of Truro. It's sort of between two of the main streets in the city centre. But interestingly, the other side from the Hall for Cornwall, we have what's basically the Tourist Information Centre, which is a shop sort of I think it's allied to Truro City Council. No Cornish whatsoever. No products inside it with the Cornish language. So lots of products which are Cornish products, from companies in Cornwall aimed at, chocolates and mugs and tea towels and whatever. Absolutely nothing with Cornish. So I found that really interesting. And, who are the audiences? The audiences at the Hall for Cornwall,
Yeah.
as opposed to maybe other entertainment venues around Cornwall, which may be far more aimed at a balance of locals and tourists. The Hall for Cornwall is generally aimed at locals, and that's using Cornish. The Tourism Information Centre in Cornwall, nothing. I found that really interesting.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
And another example within Truro as well is, there is a branch within Linguistic Landscapes thinking about the audio landscape. What do you hear?
Soundscapes.
The soundscapes.
Yeah.
And so anyone who's ever travelled on the park and ride buses into Truro, so there's one that comes from either end, basically into the city centre, or it's the same bus, it does a sort of circular route. All the announcements for the next stop are in English, followed by Cornish. Mm-hmm. And on the display screens inside the buses, there will be a sign saying next stop, college, hospital, whatever. But it will also, in a slightly different font and smaller and underneath, but it also says the word in Cornish. And those buses, yes, they are aimed at tourists in the summer, but actually the bulk of their work is commuters during the entire year. Because the bus stops at the Royal Cornwall Hospital, a lot of people who work there will commute on that bus than driving in to park at the hospital. Yeah. So that is thousands of people every day who are subconsciously hearing and seeing the Cornish language.
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And I think like this sort of site of audience and who receives the signs and maybe how they receive the signs is maybe a point we can talk about a little bit later in sort of some of our concluding thoughts as well. So some really interesting thoughts there. And I'm just kind of linking in now with your sort of observations around kind of, whether the language is sort of there for tourism or for kind of for the more kind of touristy hotspots. So obviously, as I said before, I took some photos of signage in Truro, but also Padstow as well. And as we said, Padstow is a very touristy seaside resort. So there, I guess I was expecting English, the presence of English above all, which was definitely the case. But I did spot some quite interesting examples of Cornish language too, which I'm going to delve into a little bit now. So one example which sticks in my head is a sort of an outdoorsy outfitters shop called Hagavore, which is on the main street. Now, they translate Hagavore, which is obviously the Cornish, and they translate that underneath their little tagline, and they say that it means we are from the sea, we are of the sea. So this example caught my attention because it had an accompanying explanation to one side of the shop window as well, explaining the meaning and inspiration behind the name. There were also other interesting photos which I took, such as a hardware cum camping essential shop, whose name, whilst in the English language, arguably made reference to the Cornish revival through the Celtic-style typeface in which the shop name was written. So again, that all links to the point that you were making, Kensa, about how typography can also tell us a lot about the different cultural connections and texted through signs and other sort of material in the landscape. I've also spotted sort of these forms of Celtic type lettering in other spots too. So it's really, I've found it to be quite common in Brittany and throughout my different travels in Brittany. And as we know, both Cornwall and Brittany have Celtic roots, and these are being strengthened through a current Celtic cultural revival, which links back to the original Celtic settlement of these areas many, many centuries ago. So I think this lettering in Padstow is either a conscious or subconscious reflection of this. Another example I remember where the lettering really struck me in Padstow was a gifts and souvenirs shop called Ditda, which is hello in Cornish. And again, that was written in a Celtic style typeface too, a bit like the other example I've mentioned.
And I think that's really interesting because I was just, when you were talking there, I was thinking about Ireland, and that very much there is this Irish language typeface, this Celtic sort of historic Celtic typeface that they use, and that seems to be really consistent wherever you go in Ireland, that signs use that typeface. I'd be really interested to see whether places in Cornwall are using that same typeface or whether they're using a different one, whether there's consistency, what people imagine as being a Celtic typeface. I'd also question the translation of Hagavor. So Hagar in Cornish means ugly. So quite often I'd always assume that they meant ugly sea. So sort of like storms at sea. And that's a really interesting, to go off point here, that's a really interesting consideration when using Cornish. It's great that we have these businesses as are being logged both by us but by this sort of Facebook group to do with sort of logging images of Cornish being used.
Yeah.
Where do who makes the decisions and where do they get their information?
Yeah.
So the Cornwall Council do run a translation service, and for translations up to I think 40 words, it's free. So if a business wanted to name their business in Cornish, they could probably get it done for free by Cornwall Council to get the advice. So you shouldn't name names, but I'm going to. There's a bakery in Cornwall called Da Barra. And I, as an Italian speaker, thought, oh, this is great. This is this Italian-Cornish fusion going on here, because da in Italian is like chez in French. So restaurants would be like da Tony or something, at Tony's. So I was like, oh, this is great, at bread, it's this Barrow's bread. So this idea of sort of like it being the house of bread almost. But da is Cornish for good.
Yeah.
But the problem with Cornish is that the adjective comes after the noun as opposed to English where it goes before. So I wonder whether they're actually meaning good bread, but which sort of they've looked at the words up in a dictionary and have written that, or so in Cornish it should be bread good. And so that's a whole sort of interesting line to go down about sort of where do people get their inspirations and so on. But I think what I've found in my investigations is that the actual Cornish language is sort of not necessarily visible in tourist areas.
Yeah.
But in areas which are more heritage-based, so whether that is in terms of it might be a tourist location or it might not, but if it certainly has strong links to Cornish heritage, I think those are the places where we're seeing far more Cornish language usage. And that's interesting because there is a great interest within Cornwall more generally in terms of celebrating Cornish heritage and what it is that makes Cornwall unique. And we see that in things like Padstow, Obios, St Ives feast days, all the other various feast days that we have in sort of practically every single town and village in Cornwall, like St Piran's Day, obviously sort of throughout Cornwall. And I wonder whether this increase in Cornish language usage in those sort of heritage type places is because it's this sort of growing pride in Cornish heritage and therefore a wish to sort of include the language within that. And, and those are places that might not necessarily be on the sort of, if you're on holiday in Cornwall for the first and only time, would be on your tick list of 5 places to visit in a week.
Yeah.
But they are the kind of places that possibly returning visitors might get round to. So I think that's certainly possibly an area for more research. And I also wonder whether it would, obviously we've only looked at sort of 3 places really, but it would be really interesting to look sort of further afield. I'm not great at East Cornwall, that's terrible to say, isn't it? But it's one of those places I don't get up there very often. So actually I've never been to places like Looe or Polperro, and it would be really interesting to go down there and see, because they really are touristy.
Yeah.
But with a massive sense of heritage and history themselves.
Yeah.
It'd be really interesting to see what the picture is down there. But equally places like Launceston and Liscard, which are inland.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, definitely more scope for some more fieldwork and photography there.
Yeah.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, I guess the kind of last little point I had here was about your work on different interiors, like building interiors, Kensa. So I know you mentioned sort of Hall for Cornwall and the newly revamped space there with the digital screens and the different QR codes and the trails. And that's something that really struck me there in terms of the integration of the Cornish and the co-occurrence as well of the Cornish alongside the English. But yeah, can you share any insights on some of the other spaces that you looked inside?
In Penzance, the Morab Library. So the Morab Library is a private library in Penzance, and it's been going since sort of the early 19th century, possibly a bit older than that. And it's this great both historic library. It has an archives and so on, but it also functions as a library. You can go and borrow fiction books and take them back and so on. And I should confess here, I'm responsible for these. There's an annual event called Speak Cornish Week, in which people are encouraged to just use a tiny bit of Cornish throughout the week. You might just be saying hello or so on. And I was asked by the librarian at the Morab Library to help them not so much translate the areas of their collection, but also to they gave me a list of words which reflect how people feel about the library and how they think of it.
Yeah.
So things like sort of treasure and quiet and reflective and words like that. So they have and this is meant to be a sort of one-off thing for this week, Speak Cornish Week, back in, I think, 2022. But they kept the signage up. So all over the library, in every room, you'll find several examples of the Cornish language sort of on the shelves for patrons to see and reflect on, and just to see the language sort of in situ in the rooms that people have, use and think about what the library means to them.
Yeah.
So that's one really interesting way of adding Cornish to a place, which is, tourists do go and visit it. You can go on a guided tour, but generally, the library members are locals.
Yeah.
So that was one place. And then, interestingly, it's another archive in Redruth. So Redruth is very much inland, former mining town, quite a poor area of Cornwall. And it's the home of what's called the Cornish National Archives, if you like. It's a place called Cres-and-Kearney, which opened in 2019, and it was an amalgamation of the County Record Office, which had been in Truro, and the Cornwall Studies Library, which had been elsewhere in Redruth. And this building opened in 2019. It's run by Cornwall Council. It was funded by the Heritage Lottery Fund. But right from the start, all their signage has been bilingual. So this is down to the sort of the names of the individual rooms. It's on a former brewery site. So the rooms are named after sort of the elements that make up beer. So things like water, hops, and so on. But all these rooms have those names in English, but also in Cornish. But equally, all of the signage is bilingual. So the signs on the toilet doors, for sort of like baby changing and so on, these are all there in Cornish as well as in English. And I think, that was a really sort of a statement, if you like, from Cornwall Council that they were going to do this. They were going to ensure that this was included from the very start of this building.
Yeah.
And even now, when they have sort of an exhibition space within the archive and a sort of fairly sort of regular rolling pattern of different exhibitions, with each new exhibition, the signage that goes up is bilingual, and there will be sort of bilingual descriptions of whatever's on display in English and Cornish.
That's really interesting. And I think it links back to what you were talking about earlier in terms of the ways in which language is becoming increasingly intertwined with heritage, and the ways in which heritage sites and organisations are reclaiming the language and integrating it into sort of wayfinding as well.
Yeah, and it's almost, we talk about in Cornwall this idea of businesses starting to latch on to the Cornish language as a bit of a USP. Can we name our business in Cornish? But actually, it's exactly that. The heritage sites are doing the same as well.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. They're all really interesting insights. So I guess our initial analysis leads us onto an important follow-up question in terms of our forthcoming analysis. So I guess that question would be, is Cornish targeted at those in Cornwall for tourists, or does it kind of present as quite a mixed picture? So the language is there for both Cornish people and also tourists. So this really isn't necessarily a kind of a puzzle or something to kind of consider in the Cornish context, but it's also a question which sociolinguists in other minority contexts are always grappling with in terms of linguistic landscape research. So for me, a next step could be to understand how and why signs are produced by the business owners themselves. And it could also be interesting to know how this visibility of the language is received by passers-by, be they local folks or people that have come down to Cornwall to visit. How about you, Kensa? Do you have any kind of thoughts in terms of, gone croaky, any further thoughts in terms of future steps and future points to follow up?
I think it'd be really interesting to, as you say, to interview some of these business owners as to sort of why they decided. And equally, some of these heritage centres, sort of why did they decide to start including the Cornish language? It's not an area that we've studied, but for example, Asda in Hale has bilingual signage. I can't off the top of my head think whether the Falmouth and the St Austell stores also have bilingual signage, but that's a national company.
Yeah,
a bit like Wetherspoons. We've got national companies that are starting to use the language.
Yeah,
I think that would be a really interesting line of research. I think, as we said before, sort of going towards the east and looking at the tourist-facing businesses in really touristy not that Padstow's not really touristy, in other sort of really tourist-heavy places and seeing what they do. But equally, a lot of tourist-facing businesses are outside these areas. So, the campsites and touring parks and so on. What's going on out there in the countryside? Are they starting to embrace Cornish? That would be really interesting to have a look at. And then also, I think there could be a trawling this Cornish for Businesses group, which post images of Cornish that they find out around Cornwall. Would be a really interesting source of information and to see what else is out there.
Absolutely. Yeah. Okay, well, I think that's everything. Thanks so much, Kensa, for joining me today on this first podcast adventure. So me and Kensa were aiming to write some articles on this project, which are kind of forthcoming in the near future. All that remains is to say, watch this space. Many thanks once again to Kensa for coming and sharing your insights on all things PhD and Cornish language related today. It's been really, really great. So thank you.
Yes.
Thanks so much to Kensa once again for sharing our insights and experiences from this Linguistic Landscapes project, focused on the presence of the Cornish language in different locations across Cornwall. Do stay tuned for publications in the very near future on this piece of research. Remember, if you've any thoughts as to what we've discussed today, please use the hashtag Cornish Talks, again, all one word, on Twitter. If you've enjoyed this podcast, do join me next time to explore more areas of Cornish contemporary culture on Cornish Talks. Also be sure to have a listen to the other podcasts produced by my wonderfully talented colleagues in the South West and Wales Doctoral Training Partnership. Miraz, thank you, and bye for now.